Are there no true knights among you? Subscribe to the Legion.
Directed by Natasha Kamani, who also wrote this movie. We are talking The Dreadful. This one noticeable for a Game of Thrones reunion casting. So we have Sophie Turner, who of course played Sansa Stark in Game of Thrones, and she plays a character called Anna. And we also have Kit Harington, who played Jon Snow, who also is the male lead in this. And this movie also stars Marcia Gay Harden. So you've got a pretty good cast there of recognisable actors in this kind of I'll call it medieval, and I'll explain why I said that in a minute. Medieval, gothic, romance, horror, fantasy, drama. It kind of ticks all the boxes in a way. What's the story? So this takes place in the mid to late 15th century, which is technically speaking just after the medieval period. So it's not technically a medieval movie, but it has the trappings of that sort of thing. So just for ease of trying to explain it, it's a medieval type movie. It actually takes place in the period of the War of the Roses, which was a series of civil wars in the UK, and they actually name dropped Tewkesbury, which was a later conflict in the war, so we're guessing it's probably around the kind of like 1470s, around that kind of time. Anyway, and the movie focuses on Sophie Turner's character Anna, who is a young woman who lives with her mother-in-law, played by Marcia Gay Harden, and Sophie Turner's husband has gone to War of the Roses, and he has gone, and they are struggling because they don't have a lot of money. They're struggling for food and things like this, and they end up, her and her mother-in-law, doing kind of somewhat nefarious things to try and get by, i.e. sort of murder passers-by to steal their stuff, to get money, to get food and things. And then we have a returning character who was the friend of the husband, played by Jon Snow's Kit Harington. And he is like a childhood friend of Sophie Turner's character and the best friend of her husband. And he tells Sophie Turner's character that the husband had died in the war. But he also seems to have romantic intentions towards Anna, played by Sophie Turner. But there seems to be this kind of mysterious knight in armour that is appearing and looks somewhat sort of supernatural. What'll happen, you'll have to watch the movie and find out. So, let's discuss. Alright, so what works in this movie's favour? You do have the three main characters here are all recognisable actors, and obviously it being a sort of post-medieval setting, there are clearly going to be comparisons to Game of Thrones. It's very different though. Everyone is playing a very different sort of style of character here, but nonetheless, it is still fun to see, particularly Sophie Turner and Kit Harington in a kind of a similar sort of setting at the very, very least. So you have that sort of connection, I suppose, to these sort of characters already, particularly if you're a kind of a Game of Thrones fans. And I gotta say, I think the acting is okay. I think because it's set in Cornwall, which is in the southwest corner of the UK, and they're doing kind of what we call West Country accents. I don't think they quite put it off, but I don't think the acting is necessarily bad. I think it's okay. So let me just put it that. If you're not from the UK, you'll probably think it's fine. If you're from the UK like I am, you'll probably notice that like Kit Harington sounds like he's doing a West Country impression, and Sophie Turner's accent does slip. And I could sometimes not understand Marcia Gay Harden either. So, accent work aside, I think the acting is solid. The best and biggest thing about this movie is its kind of cinematography and just general photography, because I think it really looks particularly sort of well photographed, well shot. These kind of misty fields, these kind of coastal sort of shots and things like this medieval setting with these like somewhat sort of mythical kind of scenes and vistas and things like that. I think it really looks fantastic. It's a very well shot movie, and I really think it gets kind of like this kind of historical period, but it infuses this sort of somewhat kind of supernatural element to it as well. So it has this sort of mystic kind of qualities while still being, you know, a kind of historical fiction type thing. But it looks fantastic. It really does look, as I say, if you like a gothic romance, then I think this movie's its biggest selling point is its look, is its appearance, the aesthetics, and even things like as well, like the hair and makeup. I think it's very well done. For example, Sophie Turner's character Anna, she's not at all glamorous. She's just kind of stripped down because she's effectively a peasant, and so she's really not wearing makeup in the traditional sense, and you know, so she looks kind of plain and stuff like that. I mean, arguably you could say they could have been a little bit more dirty, even considering they're basically living in a shack. But you know, the fact that they're not glam is, I think, is, you know, a step in the sort of the right direction here. I kind of quite like this knight. He's kind of treated as this sort of almost otherworldly figure, and it's obviously the mystery is, who is he? I mean, it's fairly obvious, to be honest with you, where it's kind of going, but you know, it kind of looks cool, and I think the way that character is shot is kind of shrouded in kind of mystery, and they kind of put a bit of sort of like, you know, dry ice behind him and stuff, so it kind of looks cool. And then we get kind of a little bit more overt sort of horror elements towards the end of the movie. I'm loath to call this a horror film, if I'm honest, but you know, there are certainly some scrumptious visuals here, is kind of what we're kind of getting at, and you know, coupled with, you know, some at least decent acting. However, where does this movie fall down? The problem here is, I think it's a little well, there's two main problems with this movie for me. The first and most obvious one, I think, and this is what people will say, is the movie is incredibly slow. A little test that I do with films when I'm watching a film, and I've said this in many reviews, I don't tend to go into films having watched trailers, reading synopsis. I like to go in completely blind if I can, and then see if the film can get me to go along with the journey with it. And that's a kind of a test that I tend to use. If I read too much about it, it kind of guides you in where you should be going. And about halfway through this movie, is the test I normally do and think, what's the story here? What is the journey that we're going on? And I couldn't really tell you, because the movie's so plodding. You struggle to really think, what is the actual story here? What are we meant to be following? Because the story, A, is pretty slight. It takes an absolute age to get there. It isn't a particularly long film, but you really feel like this movie is going at such a glacial pace. It's just incredibly slow and ultimately a little dull. Because there's so little to the story ultimately. It's just sort of, you know, these kind of situations that we're sort of following, and that nothing is particularly sort of dramatic necessarily outside of the odd, you know, murder here and there that these kind of two women end up sort of doing. And the actual sort of point of this story, the kind of this night and the kind of what it means, is a little bit of a sort of like a metaphor here, but it's ultimately it's just a little bit dull, to be honest, is where I'm getting at. I've already kind of covered some of the kind of the problems that I think some of the acting has. Not bad acting, but the cast here struggle with this West Country accent. I know it's meant to be taking place in Cornwall. I would have just gone with their natural accents, to be honest with you, because to me, from the UK, it sounds not good. But I think if you're not from the UK, you won't notice. I would say that. The other problem I have with it, the other main problem, is I think this movie really has a sort of, it really lacks an identity about what it's trying to do. Like, is it a horror film? Is it a fantasy? Is it a historical drama? Is it a romance? I really don't feel like it hangs its hat on any sort of particular thing, and it just kind of plods along, having these small elements of some of these, you know, or all of these kind of like little genres, but never really sort of focusing on any one particular thing. So the movie really feels unfocused, because it doesn't really feel like there's any point to it, or you're really knowing what this movie is actually trying to sort of say, and it just kind of feels like it's like never really feels like it's going in any particular direction. Like, let's take the romance, for example. So, you know, you have this situation where Sophie Turner is grieving the loss of her husband, where Kit Harington's character has told her that, you know, he's been killed in the war. But then we end up having this kind of love affair between Sophie Turner and Kit Harington's characters. But Kit Harington, the way this movie depicts him, he comes across like a stalker. He comes across like he's just there trying to sort of like sniff around Sophie Turner's character. He always just seems to pop up whenever she's like walking around, and almost like you feel like he's like hanging around in the bushes. What I think the movie's trying to just say that they just keep bumping into each other, but there's no other characters. You only ever see these two kind of crossing paths. So it almost feels like Kit Harington is like a stalker. And then she's not interested, first of all. She's absolutely just not interested. Then, like, the flip of a switch, she's all of a sudden interested for kind of no particular reason. And it doesn't really work, because I just think the movie's, like, it just doesn't have this kind of cohesive narrative where you feel it's sort of going along. And then the same can be said for the sort of the fantastical elements, the dramatic elements, horror elements. It never really feels like it ever really decides what this movie wants to be. And as such, it's just a kind of a collection of scenes where things are happening at a very slow pace, and it just feels directionless. So, you know, the movie looks great. There's some elements here. There are some sequences that are interesting, you know, dotted around, but it doesn't come together overall as a good film. Now, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. Primarily for the craft elements here, the technical elements, because I do think there's a lot to be said. I think the soundtrack is good, but the narrative is really poor. The performances are kind of mixed, and just the journey that this takes you on is just not a really an interesting one. So it's a 5 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What were your thoughts? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Yo, Joe, in today's video you saw how good looking the host was.